1010, good morning. This is Elizabeth Carp. On Election Day, New York State voters will be asked to vote on State Proposition 1, not to be confused with County Proposition 1, which has to do with electrical power. State Proposition 1 is a $500 million transportation bond issue. It's called Energy Conservation Through Improved Transportation Bond Act. It's planned to help provide funds needed to meet increasing ridership demands and to improve the public transit system. Passage of the bond issue will trigger a $980 million state transportation improvement program. Now, a coalition of groups and individuals have formed to support the transportation bond issue, and here to represent that body and to explain the provisions of the proposition is Carol Hess. She's coordinator of Citizens for a Yes vote on the transportation bond issue, and we'll join Carol Hess in just a few moments. My guest this morning is Carol Hess, and it's her nifty job to make clear what the transportation bond issue is all about. You know, I think when most of us see Proposition this and Proposition 1 on the ballot and see all that fine print, the whereases, the whereofs and the wherefores, we really kind of hold back from that. And is it a difficult job, Carol Hess, to be going around explaining to people what that transportation bond issue is?
Yeah, sometimes when you look at the title, Energy Conservation Through Improved Transportation Bond Act of '79, it is kind of a cumbersome way to describe what is really a rethinking on the part of New York State, a new emphasis on mass transit, on the relationship between our energy crisis and how we can really move in the right direction in the future. I think this bond issue addresses itself to both highway, rail, and freight improvements in all of New York State.
Well, what is the ultimate purpose of the bond issue, Carol?
It is to upgrade both commuter rails in our own community. We will benefit a great deal in terms of our commuter rails, the subway system. It has a lot of money for the freight yards, both in Croton and New York City. It'll upgrade the bridges. Right now, for example, there's very little freight that goes down through Westchester because there are bridges they can't get under. It has money for the Long Island Railroad. It is upgrading our whole mass transit system downstate. It has money for upgrading the system upstate. There is monies to upgrade the highway system. I think it's divided in an interesting way. There is $500 million total. Of that $500 million, $400 million is specifically for mass transit. There is $100 million for highways.
Well, that certainly can change everybody's life.
Yes.
It will really affect the tri-state area, even though it is a New York State bond issue. And, of course, only New York Staters can vote on it.
Mm-hmm. It will have a positive impact because it is a capital construction. It'll buy new cars for our whole system. And what is interesting is the fact that it'll also generate federal funds. In other words, it's really divided into three aspects. You've got the $500 million that'll increase the state's debt. This will cost us, it's been estimated, a very small amount, like $1.21 per person, which will increase the state debt. But in addition to this, you've got $300 million that'll come due for the Tri-Borough Bridge and Tunnel Authority in 1983. And I think this probably sounds confusing, but let me go back and talk about the difference. The $500 million are actually added to the state debt.
Yeah, well, maybe you could explain what it means when a bill authorizes the creation of a state debt.
That means we are adding to the indebtedness of New York State. New York State has something like $8 billion in debt that is paid off on a yearly basis. This will increase this debt by $500 million, and this is done often for long-term, large capital improvements. And
when they float a bond issue, then what happens?
The bonds are then added to the indebtedness, which the debt service is paid off on a yearly basis, and actually it comes out to us as individuals maybe an increase in about $1.21 per person. But the nice thing about this bond issue is that there is also $300 million that will not affect a penny of our tax dollars because they come out of the Tri-Borough Bridge and Tunnel Fund. That's part of the Metropolitan Transportation Authority.
Does that mean that money is already there?
That money, there are bonds that will be due that can be sold in 1983. And at that point, there is additional, this $300 million will be available to buy additional subway cars and Conrail cars for the whole package of this bond issue.
If we don't vote for this state transportation bond issue, this state Proposition 1 on the New York State ballot, what will happen to that $300 million when it comes due?
This may be used for, and this is one of the I think a number of people have criticized the bond issue, certainly those that live in New York City, because there's the possibility that the bond issue could be used for operating subsidies and other aspects of transit.
So it might go to New York City if it doesn't go
But
get
it is
voted on by the
allocated
state.
in this particular bond issue to go towards the purchase of subway cars. It is largely for New York City, that extra $300 million.
Of course, everyone who comes from the tri-state area uses the New York City subway at some
this
time.
bond issue takes into consideration needs of both New York City, the suburban areas, and upstate. It is well thought out in terms of its distribution of funds throughout the state, and I think this, they hope, will help in its passage in
Yes.
November.
Well, Carol Hess, what are the major transportation concerns for commuters in this area?
I think since we are in an energy crisis and people are beginning to realize we have an energy crunch, there has been an enormous increase in ridership. It's up like 10% over the last year. You find that with that, they haven't got additional cars to fit the people. People are standing. There are a number of safety problems that have been plaguing our Conrail lines. More of the three lines, we have the New Haven, the Harlem, and the Hudson. Of those three lines, the New Haven is in the best shape, but there's still serious safety problems, serious problems in terms of maintenance of the equipment, the air conditioning, the on-time record, which some people have said has improved, but if you're a regular commuter,
you may know better.
You may know better, yes.
What about the rails? And the roadbeds, are they not in need of repair?
Absolutely, and there is a lot of money in terms of upgrading the shop equipment, which will facilitate the maintenance of the entire plant.
Mm-hmm. Well, these concerns then that most of us have in our commuting time, this would all be addressed in this transportation bond issue, am I correct?
It is certainly to our advantage to see that this bond issue passes.
What has caused the increase in rail ridership that we see so much now? I guess there are some obvious answers to that.
I was going to say it's obvious. You know, you can even see in the title of the issue, the energy conservation through improved transportation. People are more conscious of how often they use their cars, and they leave them at home and they use mass transit. And this is an obvious reason, and it has definite statistical validity in terms of how many people are using the system. There is an increase, and in order to keep those people there, we want to make sure that the cars that are online are in as good a shape as they can be in.
You know, I think we all dream about having the kind of transit system, a mass transit system that we all hear about in other parts of the country where it's most successful, or in Europe, where it's comfortable and safe and even a touch of luxury.
Yes, and this is the ideal, but certainly this particular issue, this bond issue, addresses itself to getting new cars on the line.
Well, we talked a little bit about how the $500 million was going to be divided in kind of an overall way. Could you talk more specifically, Carol Hess, about how the $500 million is slated to be divided?
Sure. There are specifically about 100 million, of that $500 million, 400 million is specifically allocated in the bill to rail improvement. And of that $400 million, New York City will get 136 new subway cars for $100 million. There's freight clearance and improvements. Our Conrail system, in other words, the Conrail system is the Harlem, Hudson, and New Haven division, is slated for 60 electric cars and track improvements for the amount of about $70 million. Conrail specifically is also slated for $10 million additional for shop improvements. The Long Island Railroad will get additional new cars and shop improvements. The Upstate Rail will get additional new cars for the high-speed Empire service and other upstate high-speed services.
Will freight be affected in any way, Carol?
There is money for the freight. As I mentioned, one of the items is to talk about changing the bridges to allow freight easier passage.
Yeah.
The emphasis is, however, on rail improvement in this $400 million.
What kind of schedule is in the bond issue for the implementation of these rail projects? I mean, when will this happen?
This will happen almost immediately upon passage of the bond issue. There is a particular schedule in terms of the $100 million that go for roads. There is a defined way in which a locality can apply for the roads. It is approved then by the controller, by the governor, and then these monies can be used locally. And of that $100 million, Westchester again gets something like $4 million in potential monies that can be used by the county and local communities for road improvements.
Is that why you people have organized and feel that this is especially important to Westchester?
We do feel it's especially important, and I think everyone's vote is going to count more so than ordinarily. There are very few elections of great significance going on in New York City and in upstate. Westchester has many local, the county board of legislators are up, there are a number of local elections that are very active. We will get a larger turnout. And this bond issue has enormous benefits for us in Westchester County. If we get $80 million out of $400 million allocated for rail improvement, this is an enormous percentage because we don't represent 20% of the population. We represent a lot less. Yet we are slated for enormous improvements. What happens often when you go into the ballot, you skip those very complicated bond issues, partly because you really haven't read about them in advance, or it takes too long, they're cumbersome, there's a lot of language in there that is legal language and required by law to be in there, but it takes you 10 minutes to read. What happened in '74, the transportation bond issue, only 1/3 of the people that actually went in to vote voted on any of the bond issues that were on the ballot. So each one of us, our vote is even more weighted than it might be otherwise.
Yes. Well, I'd like to get into the conservation aspects of the bond issue because it's called Energy Conservation Through Improved Transportation Bond Act, a mouthful. And right after we take a commercial break, I'd like to come back and talk about conservation. I'm talking today with Carol Hess. She is coordinator of citizens for a yes vote on the transportation bond issue in New York State. This is Elizabeth Carp back on WGCH. I'm talking with Carol Hess. We're talking about the Energy Conservation Through Improved Transportation Bond Act that on Election Day, voters in the state of New York are going to be asked to vote on. This is Proposition 1, but it is State Proposition 1, and that's not to be confused with County Proposition 1, which you may have heard quite a bit about because that has to do with electric power, and that's for another program and another time. But we're talking about the transportation bond issue. Carol Hess is coordinator of Citizens for a Yes vote on the transportation bond issue, and we were explaining what that was and why the transportation bond issue will mean energy conservation. I know that County Executive Del Bello has said that we must support mass transit as one part of our long-term conservation efforts. And while that seems like a very obvious thought, that's something we should all understand, I think it's worth talking about why that will lead, the transportation bond issue will lead to conservation.
Well, it's been estimated that something like 70 million gallons of gasoline could be saved annually if only there was a fractional increase in the commuter use of our rails, our mass transit. And every drop of gas that we save or oil that we save by leaving our cars at home certainly has a spiraling or a chain reaction in terms of energy or gas that we save and can use for other parts of our existence.
Well, it certainly is vital to upgrade our railroads and the service that we get on them and the comfort and the schedules as well, because I know that I would be very happy to ride the rails much more than I do if I knew that I was going to get where I was going on time and I was going to get there comfortably. I mean, it makes such a difference.
I couldn't agree with you more, and as we have talked about before, the ridership has increased. And we find that the trains are often too short. We could use extra cars. We can use certainly making sure that our equipment is maintained as much as possible. And I think this particular bond issue addresses itself specifically to the purchase of new cars and to kind of encourage all of us to use the trains as much as possible.
And of course it will mean repair as well of the road beds and of the rails.
Yes, the shops For example, the Croton Harmon shops will get a $10 million specific allocation for the improvement of the shops. The shops around where the Long Island Railroad have their improvements done. The entire substructure of improvements, of maintenance of our cars are due to receive quite a few millions of dollars specifically allocated in this bond issue.
Who is supporting the transportation bond issue? Who are the people who've come out for it, Carol Hess?
It has a very, very broad range of supporters. You've got all of our congressmen, Peter Pizer, Hamilton Fish, and Richard Ottinger. I'm talking specifically for Westchester. It has the New York State League of Women Voters, and the Westchester League of Women Voters has been very active. Individual leagues will be distributing leaflets on railroad stations over the next week or so. The Westchester County Association is supporting it, the New York State AFL-CIO. To my knowledge, all of the state senators and state assemblymen are supporting it. It has a very, very broad range of support. And there are a number of commuter groups and citizen groups such as my own which have been formed and are actively supporting this issue.
What are the pros and cons? I mean, being, of course, for the bond issue sounds like you're being for motherhood in progress, but there are some people who are against the bond issue. Do you know what their position is?
Yes, there are a number of individuals and groups that have stated, first of all, that the bond issue is inadequate, and $500 million is just a drop in the bucket, and that it will only provide a Band-Aid to what is a more serious transportation problem for the whole metropolitan area. On the other hand, there are people that feel that even $500 million is too much to spend to add to our state indebtedness. So you have groups at both sides of the spectrum, one saying it's not enough to solve our transportation problems, others saying that even one penny, this should come out of our revenues rather than a specific indebtedness to the state. It seems to me this is what is put before us now as a practical, pragmatic solution to what is possible in this era of Proposition 13 thinking and has a chance for passage. It gears itself to the needs of both upstate, downstate, and the suburban areas, and blends in both highway and mass transit areas a new direction for the state. While it provides $100 million for highways, you've got $400 million of that $500 million specifically allocated for rail transit, and as we talked about before, an additional $300 million later on that will be used for our mass transit system.
Isn't there a time deadline here too, Carol, whereby if we don't get in there soon and do something about the condition of the beds and the condition of the rails and the condition of the cars, they will just deteriorate further?
There's no question about it that the longer we wait, the worse the problem is. If we can maintain our system, upgrade our system, we are that far ahead. I think New York City, often we point to the situation there. They have a deteriorating, decaying system that requires such an enormous overhaul. The $500 million will go far to buy new cars, but they are in a state which is even much further down the road in terms of a poorly maintained system. In Westchester, we have a fine commuter line, and we have the opportunity now to see that it stays so. And I think this bond issue will help.
Can we talk more specifically about commuter needs? We're talking very much about upgrading the railroad, but will this address the specific commuter needs?
Well, the commuter needs, as we have talked about, revolve around convenience, on-time schedules, safety, and the bond issue buys new Conrail cars. It buys shop improvement, and these kinds of benefits will benefit all of us as commuters.
Yeah. I think many people are not aware of the specific problems, as you say. They think of their own needs, such as on time and comfort. How did you get involved in working for the transportation bond issue, Carol Hess? I know you've been active in Rye and all as long as I can remember. I've heard your name. That just makes you sound like an ancient person. Not at all.
I have been involved in transportation issues for a number of years. There have been many, many bond issues in the past, some of which I have supported, some of which I haven't. I think this is the first one that really addresses itself to being very specific in terms of allocating money for very specific projects. I formed a a transportation group about, I guess it's 6 or 7 years ago, to try to coordinate thinking on this side of the county, on the shore side, with the Hudson side. Very often we look at what's happening here and forget that we are linked with the county and there are problems on the other side of the county. We may think that our New Haven Railroad has problems, but they are in no way near as poor condition as the upper Harlem division of the Conrail system.
What are some of the problems of the upper
They
Conrail?
are not electrified. They are in a state of the trains remind one of trains that ran along our railroad about 30 or 40 years ago. They are in very poor shape. There have been a number of active local groups that have been pushing to electrify the Upper Harlem for many, many years, and there have been commitments by the state, by the federal government, by the MTA, and for one reason or another, these have not come about. There is the hope that there may be monies in this bond issue to proceed with the electrification of the Harlem division, and I think this would benefit the whole structure of our Conrail system.
Well, Carol Hess, does the specificity of this bond issue the reason that you're supporting it when you have not supported other transportation bond issues in the past?
This is one of the reasons I am supporting it, because it says specifically there will be $70 million for 60 Conrail trains. It doesn't say just $100 million and $200 million. It says specifically what it is allocated for, so it gives us the guarantee that these monies will be used in areas that are needed, and the areas that have been outlined, whether they're New York City subway cars or they're Conrail, they're Long Island Railroad cars, they are items that are desperately needed by our whole transit system.
When you decide to give your time to something like the transportation bond issue, how much time does it require? How much does the average citizen have to give if they care enough to want to get behind a bond issue and push, or any issue that's on the ballot?
Well, you can spend as little as an hour or as little or as much as every day of your life. We have, for example, involved the League of Women Voters in many of the local leagues in Westchester in distributing leaflets at the railroad station. Now, if someone is a member of their local league, they might contact, and their league may be doing some railroad station leafleting. You may get involved in terms of being in one of these commuter groups. There's the Harlem commuter group. There are groups forming along the Hudson division as well as the New Haven line. You may be interested in your particular line. There are groups that address themselves to those issues year-round, not just to this one bond issue.
Yeah.
There are ways in which the individual can become involved if it's an issue that interests, and it does. Transportation, I feel, is such a basic part of our life, and if we don't do things now to improve our transportation, I think what we're going to do in the next decade or decades to come will be determined about our efforts today.
Yes. Well, if we continue to rely on automobiles for our major mode of transportation, we're certainly going to be in trouble. And upgrading our rail system seems to be one of the ways that will deal with it. Have you ever lived, Carol, in any other part of the country where there was another kind of rail system?
Well, I have seen other rail systems
Yes.
in operation. I did live in Mexico, and I did not when they had their new systems, but certainly recently have had the opportunity to ride their very quiet rail system.
Tell us what it's like to ride
It is
a really good rail system.
well, don't forget, our system is the oldest, and because it's the oldest,
Do you mean in this state?
I think it may be in the United States.
Mhm.
I'm not certain of the dates, but our system is certainly one of the oldest. Whereas the newer system, that beautiful system in San Francisco that I've also had the opportunity to ride, you've got quiet trains, and they're very the actual physical layout. Today we think of the space, the colors of the walls, the way in which the trains look, the visual impact is very different. And you can do this if you're starting from scratch rather than renovating and working with an old plant, which is what we
Yes.
have here.
Yeah. Well, it's lovely to think of what we could have. It would be nice if you could paint a picture for us of what we should aim for and what we could hope for if the transportation bond issue goes through.
Well, I
How
think
much of
this-
that could become a reality for us?
I think the fact that we will get new cars on the system, and the fact that it addresses itself to the needs of the commuter, the needs of the subway rider. Specifically, with upgrading our maintenance, we'll be able to maintain the rail cars at a much better rate. It also, I shouldn't forget the highways. We do have money specifically allocated for road improvement. There's $14 million for potholes in New York City. Well, that has an impact on conservation as well. I don't know, how often a bus it has on everything that goes across our roads. Certainly, if a bus needs to be in the shop 10 times more often because it's in a pothole every other day, you're talking about energy conservation if that can be improved.
Yes.
And there is money for road improvements up and down the state.
Yeah. What specifically do you think our roads need here? We don't have that kind of requirement for maintenance.
No, there are always roads that need upgrading, and it doesn't matter whether it's your village or your town road. There always needs to not necessarily have new roads. There are a number of additions that are coming to Westchester, not part of this particular bond issue, but every road needs maintenance in terms of the kind of hard top it receives and constant upgrading. We have our climate, we have snow, we have a weather problem that deteriorates the road at maybe a quicker rate than other parts of the country.
Okay, we're talking to people specifically today about Proposition 1. Now that is state Proposition 1, not to be confused with county Proposition 1 that has to do with electric power, and that's another issue. But state Proposition 1, which is going to be on your New York State ballot, it is called Energy Conservation Through Improved Transportation Bond Act. And that is a bond issue, and of course Carol Hess, who is here today, is asking you, along with the League of Women Voters and along with many of your state senators and state assemblymen, to vote yes on that.
Yes, and I feel it's important. Each one of us will have an additional weight in vote because we often forget about and not read the fine print and the involved language. Just look for what says energy conservation through improved transportation. It will benefit us enormously in Westchester. It'll benefit the entire state in terms of improvement of our highways as well as our rail system, and the actual cost per person for us will be minimal.
Yes, you said $1.21 per person.
Yeah.
But this will mean that we will have a $500 million bond issue.
Yes, plus $300 million additional funds available that we will not be charged for in terms of our indebtedness.
Thank you, Carol Hess.
You're welcome.